Good evening and welcome everyone. This is the final class in the series from fractalu.com. I'm Dan Winter. It's late February and a little bit snowy here in South France. The title of this evening's course is called The Serious ET History of Religion and Biology on Earth. And part of our little dance tonight, we're going to poke a little fun at Stephen Hawking's famous book and film, The Brief History of Time, because we subtitled this evening's course, A Brief History of God. And, in terms of the names of God in the ET history in that story, which we hope to tell pieces of this evening. And the reason that I thought it'd be fun to poke fun at Stephen Hawking's, you remember our physics class one of them was entitled The Stephen Hawking's Mistake to Not Realize the Physics of Bliss and how the universe steers its plasma, for example. So in his Brief History of Time, continuing with what I consider to be the Stephen Hawking's mistake, I think that Stephen Hawking's failed to even understand what time is, which in my view is rotating charge, which has a period called time. And we know that rotating charge has inertia called mass. And the fundamental element about time in the universe and introducing the physics of synchronicity and coincidence is the fact that every unit of time that physics has ever measured, whether it's on the other side of the universe or not, has been evenly divided into Planck time, a duration of time that is a musical key signature of every time measure physics has ever made. And saying why the time on the other side of the universe and lengths on the other side of the universe are all evenly divided by Planck, the musical key signature, would to me be the beginning of a brief history of time. Now, if you ask a physicist why Planck time and length is the same in the wave mechanics all over the universe, about the only answer that physics has is because of the Big Bang, which is to say the ultimate center of gravity. But of course, if you don't know what causes gravity, then you don't really know what caused the Big Bang. And I think Stephen Hawking is among the arrogant physicists who don't apparently know why an object falls to the ground. So I think now that we do know that the cause of gravity is phase conjugation, charge implosion, basically wave structures like this, we could do a better job describing a brief history of time, because we could describe the propagation mechanics for what created the possibility of the fact that the whole universe has agreed on Planck length and time. And in the process, I'm going to suggest we're going to get a much better idea about our brief history of God, which is what we're talking about this evening. So what's the science? First of all, let's take the simple slide here, the Dodeca universe. What is known and agreed in physics, if you believe the cover of Nature magazine here on top, we see that it's quite well agreed that the universe, the masses in the known universe, are arranged in a dodecahedron. This is documented in the study of the arrangement of the masses of the universe. So we know that the arrangement of masses around the universe are dodecahedral, which is also the geometry of the Earth grid and DNA, for example, which I call phase conjugate implosive negentropic collapse, although they don't. And the other thing is, in the same breath, New Scientist magazine has announced that the universe is actually fractal, as many physicists now admit fractality is the cause of gravity, but don't seem to know what the electric field that causes a fractal is. Now, I'm about to suggest how this is the first clue to our brief history of God, because this is an introduction to the nature of charge distribution efficiency, which is how the universe came to agree so nicely on the musical key signature of Planck, and also how God and angels seem to whisper and how collective mind and the collective unconscious works. So back to our other slide now. What is it about that, we call the phase conjugate symmetry right here, which creates that perfected distribution? Remember when we were talking about, in our article on the origins of synchronicity, goldenmean.info/coincidence, we said that charge coupling efficiency predicts the possibility of coincidences, and not just connectivity in time, but travel in time. So now this sounds like a pretty esoteric conversation, but there's a way to simplify. If the previous slide is right, that the masses of the universe and the Earth grid and DNA have all this in common, this dodecahedral structure, right here, that picture, which is what we have here, Star Mother kit. If this is what is the common denominator to the wave symmetry of the geometry of every living protein and the Earth grid and the universe, and as the universe, as even in the solar system, is dominated by planetary radii in ratio to exponents of golden ratio, is also known, that there's something about the wave mechanics of golden ratio which enables this distribution and close packing that has to do with gravity and travel in time and our brief history of God. So let's ask what it is that enables that geometry to create our origin of the sense of the divine as well as the origin of time. You see, we now know that the golden ratio locks in the distance between the wave nodes of this pent dodeca here, whether it's the pent in the pent or the Sufi flower or the Valentine. It's the golden ratio that's locking in the wave symmetry. And so effectively, the wave nodes in the Star Mother kit, in the dodecahedron, are locked into their spacing, because if they get out of golden ratio proportion, suddenly they would create destructive wave interference, which is equivalent to death for the wave nodes, otherwise known as mass, which is simply a packet of waves of charge rotating, which is the origin of mass. So the wave nodes are effectively locked at golden ratio distances called pent and dodeca. So that's equivalent to, now this is the metaphor I'd like to talk to you about, that if you look at this, the sort of Chinese pendulum right here, the balls here, I want to talk about these balls right here. If you drop one of these balls here, and all the balls are touching each other just like this, then a billion miles away, when you drop the one ball here, the other ball at the other end, one ball will pop off virtually instantly, depending, of course, on the density of the spheres. But theoretically, if the density of the spheres were high, then the rate at which the waves of that impact would travel could theoretically be faster than light, or at least the propagation velocity of that wave would approach infinite. In other words, as long as the balls are locked in place, which we now know they're locked dodecahedrally by conjugation, then if you touch one at one end, that creates a quiver in the entire nest, which is a wave that's propagated with perfect and superluminal and phase conjugate efficiency. Now, this is going to become very interesting when we see why, for example, documented telepathy requires that you place the COSY-REV mirror at the dodecahedral Earth grid waveline cross, the physics of druid phone calls and mitogenic radiation. In other words, communication efficiency, wave distribution efficiency, packet distribution, which is really simply pressure distribution efficiency, requires this phase conjugate pentodeca grid. And we now know, and this is, again, conventional electromagnetics if we study it carefully, that this pine cone shape right here of waves, called phase conjugation, pine cone shape down a cone, is how you take the transverse wave and convert the transverse inertia down to the compressional wave called longitudinal electromagnetics, compressional waves. And longitudinal waves, sometimes incorrectly called scalar or torsional, are known and proven to be faster than light. How God makes phone calls, and now we see how gravity travels. So if phase conjugation causes gravity, suddenly now we can see how the Hodorownik and Ramsey, when they used capacitors to measure, stellar explosions much more efficiently than the LIDO experiments. If you just Google the Hodorownik, I'm typing in gravity detector, get that whole story, that basically the ability to pick up gravity waves can be done with a 10-cent capacitor if you know what you're doing, because capacitive coupling for the superluminal longitudinal EMF is gravity waves. This doesn't require this very expensive gizmo, the Lido, that just made headlines. So why are we going into this whole science story right here when we're talking about the brief history of God? Well, the plasma physics, the charge distribution efficiency that creates this grid, also creates areas in the universe which are more fertile to the possibility of self-awareness. Effectively, remember, we now know that not only is the interval of adenosine diphosphate, ATP, and the time of the Earth year and Venus year, and the actual wavelengths of the only two frequencies that cause photosynthesis, all of these wavelengths are exact integer exponents of golden ratio times Planck time. So our rotational environment here was more susceptible to conjugate embedding and therefore more fertile to the birth of self-awareness. Basically, a good place to plant a DNA seed and hope it would grow up to become centripetal enough to steer stars around. Real estate is location and location and location. And our location was conjugate embeddable. Therefore, we were attractive for planting DNA seeds. So the Earth grid is dodecaecosa. The time of the Venus and the Earth orbital are exactly golden ratio exponents times Planck time. And we know that Isis, or rather Osiris, is said to be returning into the orbit of Venus, and we know it's a pentagram. So these are all the definition of the possibility of a structure in which incarnation is even possible. In other words, to be able to incarnate in something simply means if the plasma can be embedded, which is to say embeddability, which is more than an introduction to Playboy magazine. It's a description of whether one little donut, yes, we do this for every class, we'll do this for ever. Embeddability is the golden ratio that allows little donuts to non-destructively inhabit bigger donuts, and how to get into and out of the mind of gods. And that embeddability is perfected, called phase conjugation, in the wave geometry of not just hydrogen and photosynthesis, but the geometry of the Earth-Venus orbits, which are very susceptible to then charge implosion. And therefore, DNA has a better chance of growing up, getting centripetal, imploding, and steering stars around with plasma, creating bliss experience and all the good stuff. So, the brief history of God here is about the physics of the fact that there is the possibility of a divine presence. So what our view of the history of God and religion is that we agree with the Andromedans, Alex Collier and others, who said that religion was pretty much obsolete on this planet 400 or 500 years ago. It served a temporary function to help instruct people in the science of the hygiene of the acquisition of charge or bliss, called grace or chi, orgo, and baraka. But basically, at the point at which science can instruct people in those hygiene, then religion becomes obsolete. In fact, religion becomes a problem because religion creates miracle and personality worship, which is simply war. And if you want to avoid war, you replace personality worship and miracle worship with science, in the same way that governments based on personality worship, otherwise known as dictatorships, always decay, whereas governments that are based on pure principle have the possibility of sustainability. Well, the same thing is true of spiritual science. That if spiritual science is based on personality worship, it's ultimately childish crap, really. In fact, the names for personalities are names for plasma entities that become centripetal. And at a high level, and this is more esoteric, we learn that advanced plasma beings, their name and their shape and their service are one. The Ankh is actually an interstellar plasma being of high principle. So it's actually about the shape of a plasma being that creates the idea of the names of God. For example, the names of God in Hebrew Kabbalah are the symmetry permutations of 3, which is actually the symmetry operations of wave mechanics. And you know how we got into that was because our friend John McGovern, who's pretty famous there in Australia, in Flinders Range, and he had found Hebrew letters and Ophanian-Enochian letters there carved on the Adnyamatna cave walls in the Flinders Range on the north of the Bight in Australia. And studying the cave wall paint, the carvings, for example, eventually John McGovern claimed to believe that he could interpret any ancient petroglyph carving on the planet, basically, based upon a pure shamanic principle that what the shamans were always seeing and always carving were, in fact, the shadows of plasma, living charge. Now, that sounds like a very pretentious statement, but shortly thereafter, when the Los Alamos Plasma Research Institute, under the leadership of Tony Peratt there, they had discovered that if you nest 9 toroidal plasma charged donuts, one above the other, you're asking where to read. All these pictures of the plasma origins of shamanism and the plasma domains of the, in fact, after John McGovern became working with Tony Peratt, now the only place John McGovern publishes any of his work on how to read cave wall paintings is in Los Alamos Plasma Physics journals with Tony Peratt. And that whole story is at www.goldenmean. I gotta type this in here, goldenmean.info/whale dreamers. Whale dreamers. And that whole story is there, and it's quite a fun story. But there's a piece of that story that's relevant to our story here, that the physics of plasma is the origins of our notions of the divine and God and spiritual principles. And the example we were going to use was when Los Alamos Plasma Institute launched, and you see these pink plasma donuts in the picture. I should have brought them here tonight, but you can see them there. They launched 9 of these plasma donuts, just literally like smoke rings, nested one above the other. And if you nest 9 of them one above the other, suddenly, for some reason, the connection between them, in my view, phase conjugates, and becomes self-organizing. It becomes a living body. It becomes negentropic. It becomes magic. It becomes a body. A crystallized body. It was how plasma domain science discovered how to make bodies was 9 donuts. Okay, cool. Now what do we have? We have the 9 steps of the Palenque, and we have the 9 steps of the roofs of the pagoda, and we have the 9 steps of Dante's Inferno, and this is, after Enki, under the name Atun, was named Tom in Andrew Puharich's Aquarian conspiracy. He said they called this the 9, and who were the 9? Well, we know exactly who the 9 were, aside from the Egyptian Ennead and the Greek Ennead and Gurdjieff's Enneagram. We know something more. We know that when the Anunnaki Draco left, they escaped, and that's our story we want to tell a little bit of. When they escaped from the female-dominated Draco-Uras culture in the Pleiades, and they were chased, it's quite clear, the family that departed kept track of the hierarchy of the political power, literally the pecking order in their family. It was called the 9. This is all over Sumerian, Anunnaki, wherever you look, you always find out they call themselves the 9. Well, now why did they call themselves? We said, well, there was a body politic, and the term politics had to do with polis, that if you get enough plasma, called a body polis, then you can project that plasma, the origin of shamanism, the origin of the possibility of bliss, the origin of the possibility of taking memory through death, and the origin of squirting your plasma donuts across stars. You had a body polis. And body polis travels in a hierarchy of 9. So here is a clue that there is an ancestral memory in the Draco-Uras culture that what they called their star ancestors, which we'll later learn were called the Leonines, related to the Sekhmet story and the Sphinx, that their star ancestors were plasma beings that inhabited stars. In fact, they were the secret of the dark stars. And again, I'm referring now here to Anton Park's book, The Secret of the Dark Stars. And even although part of their genetic disaster was the fact that they lost long-term memory, the Nephilim, the fall, their genetic catastrophe. So there's only a whisper of wisdom in their tradition of the fact that their star ancestors were actually the plasma centripetal forces, the tornado steerers, the whirling ones, Ophanim and Okean, the star beings that inhabited dark stars. And how do you make plasma centripetal enough to inhabit a dark star? Well, if you ask Los Alamos Plasma Research Institute, Tony Peratt, who leads the physics department there, who now publishes the papers with John McGovern, who could interpret any shaman's carving on any petroglyph on the planet, he will say it's 9 donuts, one above the other, otherwise known as the Anunnaki 9. So I'm just beginning to hint here at a physics that has to do with how large interstellar plasma beings get powerful, and the wave mechanics, the symmetry operations, which enable that plasma to get centripetal and therefore able to throw its weight around, able to steer tornadoes, able to inhabit stars, able to change the centripetal force of the plasma field of the sun to radically affect the solar flares, as was measured 11 times when more than 1 million children sang the same song. So we know that somebody has the ability to inhabit stars, and there's a little clue there in the fact that all the ancient literature says if their plasma came through the heart of the sun, they're advanced. If their plasma arrived inside metal craft, they're from the wrong side of the tracks. Probably shouldn't trust them so much. So obviously, being a sun god was how you got to be important. And how you got to do that was the science of plasma. So, what is our summary of this introduction? The summary is that the concept of divine presence was central to every spiritual tradition and very useful. And divine presence desperately needs to be understood in terms of a science of charge distribution, which is why we like to teach about the collective unconscious, the communion of saints, the quality of grace, as the wave mechanics introduced by phase conjugate dielectrics, literally fractal fields, which is why we teach that this famous paper, Alice and Barium Titanate Land, about how self-organizing are phase conjugate materials. They learn to find each other like they're self-aware at a distance. And the plasma field created by the Theraphi, as Thomas and Susan and many have commented, appears to be self-organizing. It seems to know where to go. It's like a plasma donut that seems to know how to steer. In the similar way to the way our friend in Budapest always says that, George Edgley, that if you're studying ball lightning, one of the first things you learn is that ball lightning is best steered with telepathy. What is it about ball lightning, which are literally plasma donuts, that are so notoriously associated with telepathy? You talk to them and steer them around. It's sort of like learning the skills of the horse whisperer, except you're talking to plasma donuts like ball lightning. That's the best way to steer it around. Well, what is the physics? Well, the center of the donut, of the plasma donut, of the ball lightning, is a phase conjugator, and that's a communication device which embeds it in the DNA radio called this dodeca conjugate grid mechanic. So when you find the places on the Earth where these magnetic lines cross in a dodeca, you're finding interstellar DNA radio. You're finding the best version of Paul LaViolette's Pulse of the Galaxy. You're finding the access to the superluminal, the faster than light. You're finding how divine beings communicate. So, there was something very beautiful about understanding the possibility of a kind of divine presence, which is associated deeply with some very useful hygiene, which we talk about in terms of the hygiene for bliss. Unfortunately, on this planet, this same intelligence of interstellar plasma came to be associated with, like the burning bush, for example. Moses' burning bush. Well, we know what that is. That's a plasma entity that's a lot of focused charge and very capable of communication. And we know some very good things about the physics of what makes that possible. And we know, for example, that that's never going to happen in a steel or aluminum building with dead air and electrosmog. You ain't going to get that kind of phone calls to God going there, because these are non-conjugate structures, which is an introduction to how to design suitable environments for birth or death. Okay. So now we're introducing tonight's themes. So one of tonight's themes is to become, as we talk about our brief history of God, is to become aware of the difference between plasma physics of divine presence with personality worship that came to be associated with the Dracos, whom we're about to talk about. So I have this little outline in front of me. So I've checked off number 1 and 2. God is a plasma being, nature of divine presence. The other theme that's going to be recurrent in tonight's conversation is the role and origin of language in this story. And I want to bring up a very particular slide here. I'm going to go back to the ET Origins slideshow. And there's an ET Origins slideshow there in the resource materials at Fractal U. And I want to talk about this slide right here. First of all, it's well known that in Aboriginal culture, which is clearly Draco, there's so many elements of the Draco provisions, Uras, in Aboriginal culture that it's a very good metaphor for understanding the origins of our brief history of God. Kevin is asking, how is the pentagram so important to the 9? Well, that's sort of a bit of another story, but if you, Kevin, if you look at that our 3D animation at goldenmean.info/Sri Yantra, you'll see that if you take 9 golden ratio tetrahedron, one embedded in the other, the shadow will be the Sri Yantra. And that means that the golden ratio is the ratio between the embedded tetracubes, which when you then embed them, 9 of them, literally, remember, 9 donuts, one above the other, self-organize. How do they self-organize? Well, the tetracube, which is literally one of those 9 donuts, is embedded one inside the other, and then it implodes and becomes self-organizing. And so, if 9 tetracubes at golden ratio, embedded one inside the other, casts a shadow called the Sri Yantra, that means that the plasma body that becomes projective, interstellar, collective is that 9 golden ratio tetra. And each of those tetracubes, if the ratio between them is golden ratio, that essentially is pent. One of the best ways to sort of enjoy that lesson is to watch the famous child's movie called The Last Mimsy. And The Last Mimsy, you see and it's animated there at the Whale Dreamers link. You see the 9 golden ratio tetrahedron becoming yeah, that's right. Wasn't that a great movie? It was a great movie. And so literally, it's how you catch fragments of the DNA and you project them across stars. You take this plasma entity of 9 golden ratio tetrahedron called the Sri Yantra, and this creates power, and this creates projection, and this creates plasma transportation. It's really cool stuff. So very, very good clues there. So that's a hint to the beginnings of the answer to your question. So the pentagram is important to the 9 because golden ratio nesting is how you embed 9 plasma donuts. And golden ratio nesting is pent, basically. Short answer. Okay, back to where we were. Now, we're wanting to look at this theme about origin of language, and particularly now, we know, for example, that Hebrew and Sanskrit were shadows of that golden spiral on that torus donut, and you index that golden spiral on that donut to the face views of the tetrahedron, and that's Hebrew and Sanskrit, the tetracube shadow symmetry, so that's self-organizing golden spiral and self-organized torus. And most of you know my animations on that at goldenmean.info/DNA ring. Okay. But there is something more fun, well, even deeper we want to play with this evening, which is why the conflict between how the conflict between the sexes evolved with regard to the origins of language. And that's the subject I wish to focus here just a bit with this slide that's here in front of us. So what I was saying is, in the Aboriginal culture, it's well known that the shamans, the priests, the leaders of the male and the women, the men and the women's tribal leaders were forced by their religion to have a separate language. It was very important. The oldest culture on the planet, the men and the women, were forced to have a separate language. And this is going to devolve into the origin of sex guilt on this planet as well, which is the primary subject of the origin of religion. The origin of religion on this planet is dominated by fear of women and sex guilt. And in order to understand where that came from, you have to have the ET origins, because that's where it came from. And that's what tonight's conversation is about. So the reason that the Aboriginal tribes had a thousands of year long battle between the men and the women, in part, was because the men and the women had a different language by law. And this was straight Draco, Aegis of Uras. This is right out of Anton Parks in the slide in front of us. And just to make that example most penetrating, the curses cast by the women against the men and vice versa over millennia in Aboriginal cultures were such that it created desert. And if you don't believe us, ask our friend Malcolm Borgward there out of Perth, who would lead rituals up and down the Aboriginal song lines, conducting rituals to heal the war between the men and the women of the tribes. And as he did that along the song lines, huge, massive rainstorms would follow him every single time. This is not a story. This is well documented historically. And the fact is that the curse structure, the anger between the men and the women, was directly related to the drought. And we've talked about that many times in the physics of desertification. And James DeMeo did some good work on that. We have a website, I think it's goldenmean.info/desertify. So this is a very serious catastrophe that happens as a result of this anger between the men and the women that related to the fact that they were forced to speak a different language. Now, in Draco culture, Anton Parks has done an excellent job of analyzing this, and this is more in, not so much in the Eden book, but more, which is what's called Eden, which is Secrets of the Origin, and the Secrets of the Dark Stars. But the language parts of Anton Parks' discussion of this were well reviewed and summarized by Jerry Zeitlin, who translated much of that work in English. And so I have all of that material at fractalfield.com/Zeitlin, where I've reprinted some of Jerry Zeitlin's work in courtesy to him, who unfortunately has passed on. So we're looking at some tables that were edited by Jerry Zeitlin. So in the ancient time, this is instructive for our history on the planet, that the two languages for the men versus the women in Draco-Uras culture, Ages of Uras, the language was called Emesa here. The Emesa language, which was the syllabary of the Akaldan, the Akkadians, and that if you track down here in this chart, that became the Amasutum, the language of the Draco, and that, if you look down here, that became the language of the Babylonian priestess, literally the refined language, Emesa, from which we get our word to emanate. And you see down here, that language became the Akkadian, the Society Akaldan, the Akkadian language, ancient Akkadian language. And just to give an example here, just before Joseph Smith learned to interpret the flame letters, which are seraphim script, which is High Draco script, from the old Egyptian, and he learned to use the Urim and Thummim, which were, in the Mormon tradition, transparent quartz tetra, which would index the symmetry of plasma donuts, Urim and Thummim, and he studied the old Akkadian language, and he was able to read some of the genetic record of the old Draco, sometimes called the High Draco, which the winged dragons, which are called the seraphim. So we're going to talk about that a little bit, because the guy who taught him to do that was named Gabriel of the Seraphim, an angelic story. The same Gabriel, potentially, who came to Mary and inspired what was called a virgin birth. And we know from Michael Sarian that what virgin birth means clearly in ancient religion, fact was virgin birth means a Draco or a Nephilim or an Anunnaki had sex with a human, and there was a birth, and that was called virgin birth. And we now know the physics of virgin birth, and there are many examples related to intense bliss experience, that the plasma charge is what dimples the egg. And so biologically, virgin birth is well studied, and we know some of the physics. Bliss experience is a good trigger, but plasma communion, so a charge density, which is literally the pinprick, which causes the fertile egg, causes the egg, not the fertile egg, to become fertilized, because it initiates the sequence of spin symmetry operations called turning inside out, otherwise known as meiosis, mitosis. So basically, the egg that learns to turn inside out does so because its charge spins so densely on its surface that it dimples. And the initiation of that dimple is a capacitive experience. That's why X number of sperms are required to focus on an egg to actually fertilize, because they have to initiate a critical mass of charge to initiate literally a tornado on the surface of the egg. And that's what starts the turning inside out process, hence the physics of virgin birth. So it's very interesting when he says, Michael Sarian is saying, well, virgin birth is really a name from an Anunnaki who overshadowed a human female. What he's really saying is that there was a plasma communion possibility. And all of this is actually embedded in the history of a culture that knew how plasma bodies were projected, which is actually reflected in the language here. So, you know, the whole story of Gabriel, you remember, Gabriel is the guy, apparently, who started the Muslim religion. It was Gabriel who talked to Muhammad, and Gabriel is the guy who came over to Mary and said, hey, you're going to have a kid, Jesus. And Gabriel is the guy who came to Joseph Smith. So we'd really like to know what Gabriel's agenda was. Don't you think that'd be relevant for our short history of God? Well, Gabriel apparently had a genetic agenda. And that genetic agenda included that they would burn the genetic record as a sequence of plasma donuts on gold plates, copper plates. And these are the famous copper plates of the seraphim, the high-winged Dracos. And why were they going to so much trouble to keep all these genetic records? Because they had come, among other things, to an erroneous conclusion, which was that DNA that changes is defective. This is a Draco rule. If the DNA changed, it's obviously defective, which is related to the Monsanto mistake, which is not to realize that genetic diversity is in fact how DNA becomes self-aware, or fractal, or how it evolves. So the Monsanto mistake is actually a Draco mistake. Doesn't that make you feel better? So in their culture, there are many things to realize. First of all, every indigenous culture on the planet appears to know that they came, the Draco, Uras, Ulu, Anunnaki, Nephilim, they came from Pleiades. You know, every culture, from the Maori to the Japanese, the indigenous peoples all know Pleiades was the Hopi know. And so what was happening in the Pleiades that set up this genetic disaster? That their metabolism was different. And I have to acknowledge Bill Donovan, Elizabeth, for some help here. He did this analysis of the chemistry of Draco blood, which is the article fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. And by studying the history here, it becomes rather clear that home star Alpha Draconis, and Anton Parks even identifies some of the home star Thuban, which you know, Thuban featured in Dune, but Thuban is also the Thiuba story of the French ninth planet, abduction of the ninth planet story from the French is Thiuba, which they say is the origin of Yehovah, Yahweh, from Thuban in Alpha Draco, which, remember, Alpha Draconis, the shape of the star system, is the Arabic letter L, as in Elohim, those who would like to make the phase shift, you know, the letter L. And so their genetic disaster began with their error in not understanding how genetic diversity produces fractality, produces self-organization, produces phase conjugate negentropy, and therefore evolution. So no, for them it was quite different. DNA that changes is defective, and they need all these genetic records, these gold the gold plates and copper plates on which they've carved these shadows of donuts, the index sequence of genetic turns of mind. These were genetic records. This is Mormon history. How did they come to this conclusion that DNA that changed was going to be so defective? Well, when Bill Elizabeth did that analysis of the chemistry of alien blood there, which is in the article there, fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood, he became convinced that the home star, probably in Draconis and later in Pleiades, and actually Anton Parks has quite details about which star systems in Pleiades they occupied. Tegata, for example, and there are maps of the Pleiades and detailed descriptions. And I personally think that Anton Parks did a great job there. But anyway, Bill became convinced that the home star probably had a methane environment, and the chemistry of their blood required that they were using not iron for oxygen transport like we do, the red blood, the Adama, the Takadama, the red race, the iron blood race, Skanda, Asaka'an, these are the red race. No, they were using a lipid or an oil-based blood. Somebody who likes French fries at McDonald's. No, they had an oil-based blood, and they had a red or a white phosphorus, which did the bonding for charge transport, hence the red and white Draco and the Rothschilds and the whole the white Dracos, and this becomes later our story when Enki's mother slipped in some of the white Draco blood, white phosphorus, that he got the first fertile female, the roots of the Caucasian story, and it's very detailed there in Anton Parks. I think they did a good job. But because they had that oil blood from a methane environment, they breathed in mostly nitrogen, and they breathed out cyanogen, the poison breath, the fire breath, literally the flame breath of the Draco, the dragon's breath. And further, they were actually flammable. They're afraid of fire because it's true. The straight Draco Uras blood with an oil-based blood, they are flammable. And there's an oil cartel about that too. There's a lot of karma here. But the other thing was that we're going to talk about the separate languages came about because in the home star Thuban, if you read the Thiuba stories in the Ninth Planet in French there, who is it? The author, I was trying to remember the author. We'll think of it. But anyway, if you read that, on the home star, they were androgynous. But at a certain point in their history, they split and began reproducing sexually, which radically accelerated evolution. It's true, it always does. Biologists can tell you sexual reproduction accelerates evolution greatly, but sexual reproduction started the war of the sexes. The females were biologically more powerful by nature, and they are still today, if we understand it correct. Oh yes, thank you very much. Here's the book in French. It's called Abduction to the Ninth Planet by Michel Desmarquet, and this is the story of the French hero being abducted to the Draco home star Thuban in Alpha Draconis, Thiuba, the origin of the word Yahweh, and experiencing these androgynous ancient Draco beings. And so the split, when they began reproducing sexually, initiated a war between the sexes, and the fact that they began actually speaking a different language between the men and the women. The female language, a Mesa from Emanate, the male language, Imagir, from the language of the Imayan, and that became Sumerian, and Sumer, in many S-O-M-M-A-I-R-E, even today in many languages, means dragon, Draco. And so the male language, which later then became Egyptian, was different than the female language root, which became Akkadian. And if you know these roots, you learn so much about history. But now we want to finish another theme we began about radioactivity. You see, on the home star, there was a higher level of gamma radiation. And the gamma radiation actually can serve in many blood chemistries an electron transport function. I urge you to study what is the Paul Brown nuclear battery. And I believe some of that material is in our conjugate1.com energy project, and it may be in the implosionamp.com group. So the nuclear battery uses a low amount of radioactivity to achieve high electron transport release. Basically, it was a form of bliss process for the ancient Draco. A little bit of radioactivity was actually necessary for their metabolism. This is a hypothesis from Bill Donovan, now Elizabeth, which I think was very useful. So, many years later, if you read the article, actually I think we have the slide here. In Russia, when we tell this story, we let's see if I can find the slide number. There's a couple called the Iradia couple who were clearly born too close to Chernobyl. Here they are. There's the picture. Oh, yes. We have to say that our life is now under a ban. That's right. Their blood chemistry is functionally illegal there in Russia. But there they were. They were born too close to Chernobyl and grew up, and their blood chemistry devolved toward more of the ancient Draco blood, which actually achieves a form of peak perception due to radioactivity. And I wouldn't be surprised if also their metabolism of nitrogen was more central. There's a whole thing about this. It's interesting that Keshe is saying, oh, well, you only need nitrogen. Well, that's straight Draco. So the nitrogen breathers, lipid oil blood, they're poisoned by oxygen and they're poisoned by water. So like I say, French fries and Coca-Cola is a perfect metabolic stimulant if you have Draco blood. What's taking over on the planet Earth? Radioactivity and oxygen dropping. So the joke is, of course, you know who's winning the oxygen wars. Remember, why were they called the oxygen wars, the Orion wars? It's the movie Total Recall in retrospect. It's an oxygen war because the oxygen breathers and the nitrogen breathers, they require a different environment. And remember, when the Anunnaki Draco arrived here, they said the catastrophe was that they began aging catastrophically and rapidly. And we now know why, because, of course, the suspensors, which kept Harkonnen and Dune alive, and imagine, I always joke, Ariel Sharon on life support. Maybe that's not fair. But basically, an electrical environment prevented aging, and that needed to be artificially maintained, and that's what's called raising a Shem unto the Lord. And raising a Shem unto the Lord, which we now know is like a stone circle or a pyramid building, which makes a phase conjugate charge or plasma environment, which prevents aging. So if you want to build a Shem unto the Lord, don't ask a priest, because this was later called an altar in the church. That's how the word Shem got translated. No, even Sitchin knew better. He called it Highward Firestone. We now know raising a Shem unto the Lord is the physics of knowing how to build bioactivefield.com. And there's a commercial application to this, and that's good because, let's be self-empowered about the science of spirit and apply this. So anyway, the catastrophic aging had to do with the fact that they had to have an artificially maintained phase conjugate or fractal field, otherwise they would age catastrophically. And this was the plasma science which led to what we have today, Therify.net. And you note at the Therify, the two plasma tubes, which they thought were light bulbs, but they weren't just light bulbs. No, they were bioactive field plasma generators. And this is the history of the science of life force and bliss on this planet. So what the article Fusion in the Blood talks about at some length there is the fact that the blood chemistry of our ancestors, Draco, when it was crossed with the humans, remember, Ebi, Uru, Hebrew, Ebi, the bird tribe, bird brain, cross over with Uru, a dragon, the reptilian brain stem. And if you ask a Hebrew priest what the word Hebrew means, he says crossing over, and at least the Hebrew priest did get that right. You're crossing over this bird tribe with the seraphim, which is Ophanim and seraphim, ancestrally. And so the Uru, dragon blood, gets its bliss from a completely different blood chemistry and psychophysics of bliss. Where the humans, for them to have bliss, they need charge density, they need pristine oxygen, and they need yoga, and they need all the things we talked about in the hygiene for bliss. Whereas bliss for a Draco is quite a different experience. It's a critical amount of radioactivity, a critical amount of nitrogen, and low oxygen and low water. So you can probably figure out where on this planet the Dracos are winning. It's called Dune. In Dune, where the water goes away, the Dracos like it. Where the oxygen goes away, the Dracos like it. Where the radioactivity goes up, the Dracos like it. So if you want to get, maybe the Draco shapeshifters out of the U.S. Congress, for example, you just pump in some oxygen, and the plasma parasites would leave. It's very simple science. But we're more than joking about this. We're trying to talk about the stellar history. So let's see. Now, the couple other themes before we go through our slideshow. So we talked about goddess plasma being nature of divine presence, male versus female language. We're about to tell that story about when Enki and Anu and family escaped from Pleiades. They were running from a matriarchy. That's part of the history. We'll tell more about that in a minute. But that sets up a condition of fear of women here on this planet, which we need to understand more about. We talked about a virgin birth and what that meant. A little bit more about fear of women and fear of sex. And let's use the example of circumcision and female genital mutilation, which is so central to many religions on this planet. It's well proven, thanks to help here that I had today, that circumcision can be documented anthropologically to create cultures that are more violent and less feeling. And we know that circumcision, by not enabling the male to delay orgasm, prevents the male and female orgasm from achieving synchronous simultaneity, which makes the tantra more plasma projective. So in a sense, it's disempowering to human tantra to have circumcision. So it's part of fear of sex, actually. There's 1,000 ways in which humans were prevented from having psychokinesis by the fear of sex and fear of women that came from Draco. And this is what we need to sort out if we were to be restored to our psychokinetic, plasma projecting natural bliss state. And one of them has to do with fear of sex and fear of women. So you see how by preventing proper delayed excitation of the male penis with circumcision, the male orgasm would happen too early and not be synchronous with the female orgasm, which naturally happens later. Because if it happens together, the humans become so plasma projective, the real physics of Tantra, which is obviously plasma embedding, which is a true form of psychokinesis along with natural bliss process. So all of this is disempowered by this fear of sex and fear of women that came to dominate Earth's religion. And it dominated our religion because when Enlil and Enki got here, they were running from a female-dominated culture, the culture called Asa Uru, from which we get our word Asuras and dinosaur, for example, which were Draco created. Din mean place of the Anunnaki. Asa Uru, the Asuras. Asa quite literally meant female queen of, and Uru meant of the ancient dragon blood, as in Uru Asa Elem, Jerusalem. In Europe and Ural, the word URU, which is so common in our language. And what historian could look at all of the terms? Let's see, do I have that here? Yes. What historian could look at all of these words, Uru, in our language? Here they are. There's Durga, Ur, Asa Uru, Urak Uru, Ursprung, Ein Sof Ur, Burg, a container of Ur. So here's the word you are in our history, Uru. And what historian worth his salt could ignore the question of who is Uru after you look at this chart? In order to understand history, you're going to have to know who Uru is, or you're basically clueless about history. And that's where a short history of God comes in tonight's conversation. Who is Uras, ancient Uru or Draco blood? Now, we agree that there were probably 22 ET species involved in hacking up the DNA on Earth, but the dominant one, as they were dominant among the Greys, the Khmer in Reticulum, and they were dominant here, was the Draco, the Uras. And to understand their culture is to understand our short history of God. So maybe that's where we can start telling that story. Anton Parks in Secret of the Dark Stars picks up where Enki, later called Ea, for whom Earth is named, and D'(A), D'(EA), Dea, for whom God is named. So Earth and God are named for Ea, so who the heck was he? Maybe we need a short history of God to answer the question. In order to understand that table, also, we're going to go to our graphic that we used for tonight's course, slide number 15 here. Here we are. So this is a chart here showing across the top the names of the family that escaped from Pleiades. Dad was Anu, father of Enki and Enlil, and the two major sons, Enki and Enlil. Actually, we think Anton Parks was right that after Enki crawled out of the cloning cookery that his father Anu cooked him up in Pleiades, as described in detail in Anton Parks. Later, Enki's job assignment was cloning, otherwise known as Nudimmud, Enki's other name aside from Ea, and Nudimmud means the cloner. And one of the first things he cloned was a defective series of clones which they tried to destroy, otherwise known as Enlil, later named Yahweh. And Enlil usurped. He was not the brother of, no, he was not the son of, no, he was a defective clone of. Later, and I think Anne Rice got it right when she named the father of all vampires, Enlil, E-N-K-I-L, as a plasma entity that never could make it back out through the heart of the sun. This is what we call the Grim Reaper at death. It's a plasma entity that's very hungry, quite literally a hungry ghost, you know. And so we need to know, how did Enlil Yahweh evolve to that state? The other thing we know about Enlil Yahweh, if you read The Shining Ones by O'Brien. See, Anton Parks really takes Sitchin to tasks and says Sitchin did such a terrible job of translating and da-da-da. He really doesn't have much sympathy for Sitchin, so he doesn't even think he read the Sumerian. But he says O'Brien, who wrote The Shining Ones, did a better job. And in The Shining Ones, O'Brien tries to translate the Sumerian tablets and concludes that the Draco, the Shining One, the Nephilim, were the heroes of history. They saved agriculture, they saved the humans, they saved this. So these are the heroes of history. It's sort of like shades of Lawrence Gardner in Genesis of the Grail King saying the dragons are the heroes of history. Whereas you have David Icke saying, oh, these reptilian dragons, these are the curse of history, and they're the parasites of history. Well, you know, who's right? I say they're both right. You know, we have met and encountered the enemy, and it is us, as Pogo would say. No, but the funny thing about when Anton Parks is criticizing O'Brien's Sumerian tablet translations, he points out, he actually goes into detail. He says, O'Brien skipped all the tablets where it talks about the Anunnaki Draco being mean. So these he just conveniently forgets to translate. So there's dozens of Sumerian texts which describe Enlil's activities in detail. In fact, Enlil's other name transliterated, means the hater of humans. And what he was famous for was running around and killing humans. Humans were to be used for slaves and snack foods, and Enlil Yahweh was quite clear. So I think the Jews are really quite dumb for worshiping Yahweh, and if they'd like to know more, they should read Anton Parks. And I'm going to try to be democratic here and criticize every religion equally in this program. You know, we don't have much more sympathy for the Catholics. either, because, talk about parasites and whatever. No, I think religion was obsolete hundreds of years ago, and what we need to teach is the science of spirituality, and we can eliminate these religion wars. So, this family here, Anu, Enki, and Enlil, and Enlil, Enki's science officer, Thoth Hermes, later named Tehute, the line of Tehute, which was later abbreviated TWDT, Tehute, which is our word Thoth, as in Thothmosis, and Hermes. Later was transliterated DWD and called the line of David. So the line of David in the Bible is actually literally the children of Thoth. And Thothmosis literally means, which Thothmosis is the name of the whole line of Egyptian kings, and Thothmosis, if you transliterate that word, Moesis, means the son of. Who? Sons of Thoth. Thothmosis is the name of the line of Egyptian kings. And of course, conventional historians like Vincent Bridges, sadly, had to insist that Thoth is a myth, but they're wrong. It was embarrassing them to know that there's actually an ET connection here. So conventional historians have to deny this. And this is childish. In fact, the Thothmosis line, sons of Thoth, later called, when Akhenaten changed his name to Moses, it was illegal to pronounce the name Akhenaten. You could be killed. So he was simply called the son of Moesis, or Moses. And Moses then became a gold powder cook and founded the Essenes, and that it's all downhill from there. It becomes the Jesus story, where the son of Moses. And, Lawrence Gardner was no slouch when he discovered the Egyptian origins of the Christian tradition and agreed that Akhenaten probably was Moses, the founder of the Essenes, and therefore the righteous priest, and therefore the Jesus story becomes mostly a transliteration of Akhenaten's son, Tutankhamun, who is the biggest part of the Jesus myth, actually the righteous priest story, etc., etc. And so Lawrence Gardner, when he initialed to support the Out of Egypt and House of the Messiah books by Ahmed Osman on the Egyptian origins of the Christian myth, was referring some pretty detailed academic analysis of history when he concluded that yes, the Egyptian story is actually how the Christian story starts, the whole sun god mythology around Tutankhamun. And then later, because basically Jesus is a sun god. Later when Maurice Cotterell wrote Tutankhamun Prophecies, and he said the solar physics of Viracocha Quetzalcoatl in the Americas was so identical with the solar physics of Tutankhamun that it was proof that the Viracocha Quetzalcoatl stories in Central America was quite literally the same family as the Tutankhamun Akhenaten story in Egypt. Well, who is the Tutankhamun? Tutankhamun-Ra, he was really Tutankhatun originally, and Atun is basically the sun god Enki, who later became known as Osiris. So solar physics is actually what Viracocha Quetzalcoatl and Tutankhamun were about. And Maurice Cotterell really got that part of it right in his book, Tutankhamun Prophecies. So while we're on the Egyptian part of that story, we could just talk about that a little bit. So the two families at the time of Akhenaten were the Amun priests, which is basically Enlil, and for their bliss, they were addicted to mushrooms, if we believe Ananda Bhasman. I think he's probably right about that. Whereas the bliss ritual of the Atun priest, the sun god priest, which is actually Enki's side of the family, it was the Atun priest versus the Amun priest, which is quite literally the Enki versus the Enlil halves of the family. That's what the Egyptian Atun Amun controversy was about, and that's when Akhenaten, we believe, had to run for his life. And so the Amun priests were, their bliss was a mushroom addiction, which we believe now creates a kind of dependency, which is more of a sort of hive mind quality. Whereas the bliss ritual of the Atun priests, according to Ananda, was the acacia root, which was the soma, a much more a refined bliss process, and a plant medicine that produced shamanic projections that were more capable of inhabiting the sun, we believe. But at any rate, the bottom line is the politics of that day in Akhenaten. Remember, Akhenaten's time was an important turning point in history. All agree, God King Akhenaten by Daniel Stewart, et cetera, et cetera. It represents a certain climax in the evolution of the Battle of the Two Brothers of East of Eden. Remember, the town I was born in was named East Eden, and my brother Michael is a banker, and the grapes of wrath were across the street, and that was just before Steinbeck wrote The Winter of Our Discontent. So there, now you've had my jokes for the evening. Everyone needs to be a little bit archetype in their lives. It gives them a sense of meaning. So the Amun priests in Egypt were the bankers, quite literally, and the Atun priests were those who designed the bliss rituals. So there is Akhenaten, who gets his assignment from the Syrians, which was to build a solar temple, Amarna. I'll type it in. It was called Amenti, and Amarna, and I have that pictures at goldenmean.info, goldenmean.info/Amenti, and you'll see the pictures. So why were the Syrians so intent on giving Akhenaten a job to do, which was to build a solar temple, Amenti, in which, if a group of people could synchronize their bliss process properly around star alignments, they could project the bliss plasma cocoon collectively, the collective lucid dream, and actually take their plasma collected cocoon out through the heart of the sun. In other words, they could grow up. This is what the ancients called Dharana, or Stargate. This is what Jerusalem actually was. J-Uru Asa, I'm typing this in, L-M. Jerusalem was, Uru Asa L-M was the place where the queen or the royal blood of the Asa, of the Uru, dragon blood, could make the L or phase shift. Terry says, sounds like the culmination of Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's Ends. Childhood's Ends. Exactly. Thank you, Terry. That childhood's end in this case is the moment when you discover you are a sun god, which is to say your plasma could grow up and inhabit a star. And by the way, that's not escapist. It's the only doorway out of kindergarten. Another way of saying that the solar plasma heart, otherwise named Anu, we know what the geometry of the solar heart is. It's seen clairvoyantly. It's an Anu, slipknot, 7 spins outside, 5 spins inside. We've talked about the 5 spins of the tetra cube into a dodeca, makes 7 spins outside. 7 spin symmetries of the tetra, index the Urjev human heart muscle, hydrogen, and the heart of the sun. And the 5 spins inside is the 5 spins of the cube that make the dodeca. So that slipknot called Anu, seen clairvoyantly, which is the name of the heart of the sun, and the geometry of the heart of hydrogen, and the symmetry of the human heart muscle, 7 layers. The whole story fits together. It's perfect. Slipknot. So that heart of the sun is the only plasma being with the inertial escape velocity for a way in and out of here, which is what Enki and Akhenaten roughly meant by become a sun god. So the Syrians were so dedicated to have Akhenaten finish this temple because, as Anton Parks always said, fundamentally the war is always over where is the Stargate, which is to say, where is the Dharana. Remember, the alphabet used to make the movie Stargate, which was made by my boss, Rick Hasson, at Transcon Gaium, who made that film. And here is the picture. I just happen to have that handy. So these letters here on the edge of the Stargate that control the hypercube symmetry angle of the plasma insertion designed to create that vortex wormhole tube, otherwise known as Dharana or Stargate. And that alphabet is Ophanim Enochian. And we reviewed that all at this art, and we're so glad that Teresa and Alan are here because that's their the actual technology of doing that work. That's what Teresa and Alan do, and they will be teaching that as they did in Turin with us They'll be teaching that in Prague this year. And the web article I'm typing in here now, goldenmean.info/Ophanim. And so when Vincent Bridges was studying those ancient letters of the Ophanim Enochian, and let's see if I just happen to have some of those letters here, that the symmetry that those letters were arranged in the table here, and this isn't the whole table, this is part of it. Actually, I think I have to. Okay, if you take the Ophanim Enochian letters, the alphabet, and you literally wrap yourself in a ball and you embed yourself in that shadow of the plasma domain, and you see what Darlene, who did this great work on analyzing these, she's saying that here is how toroids nest. This is how a plasma embeds. And if you take elements of those vortex here, and you actually see that different parts of those plasma tornadoes, if you lay them out in a table, you have the table of the Ophanim Enochian letters. And what Vincent discovered was the pattern by which those Ophanim Enochian letters are laid out in the table is called a hypercube. A tetracubic tetrastellation hypercube, which in my view evolves to become dodecahedral, although Vincent didn't quite see it that way. And remember, just before John Dee steered the biggest tornado storm that in recorded history, called The Tempest by Shakespeare, who learned there in Prague with John Dee and Kelly, that John Dee, with the largest library on the surface of the planet, was the mathematician expert in the mathematics of hypercube. And so he's calling the angels, these large plasma beings, with his understanding of these symmetry operations of these vortex, which become, this is not the tablet of Nalvaj, but it's the central tablet there. What's this tablet called, Teresa? You see, if you use the English letters for these Ophanim letters here, and you arrange them in this table, and you read down the table, it's Zavkiel, Zadkiel, Kunael, Raphael, Haniel. Here's Mikael, and here's Gabriel, which is a sequence of symmetry operations for plasma donates, by which you make a living plasma body of interstellar dimension called angel. And if you study the physics of the group plasmauniverse.com, they're quite happy to agree that angelic bodies are plasma physics. This is not new information even. But the symmetry operations that hold interstellar plasma bodies together and how they communicate by blowing smoke rings to each other with the right symmetry to cast a spell. It's related to the tablet of Nalvaj, but anyway, that's the angel tablet. So let's talk, since Terry and Alan were there. When Terry and Alan, who are with us here right now, taught this science there in Torino with the Advanced Ophanim group, and we should acknowledge Kudai and the Italian Ophanim study group there. When they first taught this, you stand in opposing corners. And Terry, what were the letters? It was four letters you start with on the four directions, and you visualize the four directions, and you close your eyes and you fill the optical cortex with one single Hebrew letter or sequence. One of them, for example, in one of the directions was Adonai, if I recall correctly, Terry. And so what you're doing is it's like a Hebrew rabbi making a golem. The optical cortex is literally a plasma donut, literally. So when you fill your optical cortex with one Hebrew letter only, we know exactly the physics. You are choosing the tilt angle for a smoke ring torus donut of plasma charge called a Hebrew letter. The Hebrew letter is simply the tilt angle. It's literally a tilt. Now, if you get that donut of charge, that smoke ring at the right angle by completely filling your focus, your inner vision, with one Hebrew letter at a time, and then you, just like you're sending a telepathy to a horse, you stamp your foot and you release the thought form and you blow the smoke ring. Well, if those smoke rings arrive at the center in time and space at the right tilt angle, when they converge at the center, they do something called phase conjugate, or implode. And that's what's called casting a spell. It's the actual physics of the meaning of casting a spell. It's why, for example, if the ritual is powerful, it'll blow the doors off the church. Actually, powerful ritual will normally cause a dramatic change in the air pressure in the room. Ah, yes, thank you. So in that particular ritual, thank you, Terry, being so helpful. What you invoke in the four directions vary with great discipline at the time, and it takes such inner force and focus to hold that plasma toroid, that plasma domain, that thought form, one at a time, very focused and charged. Remember, you're invoking ancestors because ancestral memory, which is the collective agreement of all the DNA of the universe, has to agree to send you the charge, because if your attention is pure, if you're not a shareable wave, you don't deserve to inherit the spin to spin up your donut. So you have to invoke this presence with all the pure intentions. But that, and Terry is saying, so those four letters were Yahweh, Adonai, Ehea, and Agla. And so this is just the very beginning, the rudiments of a true Ophanum Enochian angelic ritual. But extending this to the seven hills of Prague is how we believe that John Dee created the storm that effectively took out the Spanish Armada, which was the meteorologic rarity in history. A storm has never come out of the North Sea like that before or since, and the Spanish soldiers are still returning from the west coast of England today from that storm. And the description in Shakespeare, who studied there with Dee and Kelly in Prague under the name Francis Garland in John Dee's notes, the description later became the famous Shakespeare, The Tempest, in part. This is the fairy tale. But the physics, whether you believe the fairy tale, is not even important, but the physics is important. So remember that John Dee told Queen Elizabeth that storm was going to take out that armada a year before it happened. He had a year to prepare that. And that's plasma navigation. That's what that is. And that's important physics. And it's appropriate that countries like the United States should suffer desperately from weather that's out of control until they learn to talk to their large elemental and ophanic angelic forces, the gnomes and the undines. So as long as those elemental forces, the plasma beings in the United States, are being ignored, it's very appropriate that the United States should have chaotic weather. It's totally appropriate because those large elemental forces, they regard us as drunk, quite literally, for not working with them. And the clairvoyance and the skill to work with elemental forces is essential to the very definition of culture. Some of those pictures are written up here at goldenmean.info/geobiology. So we see what this is about, that the short history of God here is actually a history of the discovery of the plasma science of spirit, and that in ancient times, calling the Dracos God was perhaps appropriate because the humans at that time were pretty humble. They were pretty weak, and the Dracos had all the power, so they were quote unquote God. And Lawrence Gardner gets some of that right also when he's writing in Ray is asking, could I ask if harp is part of this tempest? Well, you know, I was quoted in the book When Angels Don't Play This Harp by Nick Begich. I liked him a lot, and clearly using megawatts of RF power to selectively heat the ionosphere to steer plasma is a very crude way to do this, and very perverse and very sad. So yeah, it's sad that the humans don't realize that the plasma geometry of our atmosphere is actually a living being who could get very upset. And that's just pure sadness. And it's because we don't really even realize that our environment is live. So at one point we've documented that Gaia is negentropic and self-organizing. And I have documented that the Schumann harmonics that make Gaia negentropic and self-organizing fit the equation on the cover of my book for a reason. So we know exactly how to make Gaia more alive and have more climate emerge from chaos, but we're too stupid to use those instructions. So, you know, I think we deserve our climate chaos, but that's another story. So we were trying to understand how the humans became so caught up in this idea of God that remember, so they arrived here and they crafted how to make artificial environments to prevent aging, and then they crafted a cloning culture, so nicely documented by Michael Tellinger, who's actually found where the cloning vessels were that Enki used, as well as the gold mine layouts that Enki used in South Africa. We actually know what the cloning vessels looked like and which Draco women were used to clone the humans. And this is a very detailed and well-documented story. It's nothing to be embarrassed about. It's historically real. What we need to understand is how to emerge from that, having the possibility of getting a soul. That's the important thing. And getting a soul requires learning how to ignite DNA. And that possibility was planted in the humans because the Kadistu, which is actually where we get the word caduceus, which means the life designers, were the agency behind Enki's mother, who was giving him instructions on how to create the bullet in the furnace, the vaccine to the Orion Wars, which was the possibility that humans could evolve a psychokinesis, which the Dracos could not. That's why I think it's so hilarious when the Draco Charlie, who apparently was running the Montauk Project, and I've talked to Michael Ash about this and some Preston Nichols, the Draco Charlie was very mean, who was abducting the teenagers to steer the time chair at Montauk, otherwise known as the Time Empath, who originally was Michael Ash, which is a pen name, and I've spoken to him. And why did the Dracos have to abduct human teenagers to steer the time chair at Montauk, later called the movie Contact? Because the Dracos could not steer in time themselves. Basically, their genetic disaster did not meant that the superluminal or longitudinal component of their aura was not phase coherent. That in Egyptian terms is called the Ba from the Ka. So if your aura is not phase coherent enough to conjugate, you can't implode and accelerate a component of your charge envelope, the Ba from the Ka, which is the seed that's pushed out of the husk, which is the portion of your charge bubble which can withstand implosive phase conjugate charge acceleration to the point of making the longitudinal component, which is the superluminal faster than light component, which is known as the L in Elohim, or the Ba from the Ka. And without that kind of coherence, your aura cannot steer in time, which means among the Dracos, you don't get a good job. You're not a star navigator, you're not a guild navigator in Dune. Even if you float in the liquid gold powder, which is how they did it in Dune, you still can't steer faster than light. No, you have to have the kind of phase coherence which is indicated by the ability to lucid dream, the ability to take memory through death, the ability to actually see past life memories. You have to become literally an archon or a time lord, sometimes known as a tron. And that ability to become that phase coherent in your aura is the part about growing up. That's the real meaning of having a soul. In practical terms, if you read our article, goldenmean.info/DNA manifest, we talked about this in our Science of Bliss course. But the real meaning is that here you are having a bliss experience, your eyes are closed, you're imploding charge, your brainwave power spectra, golden ratio, and now the right and left hemispheres lock in at 180 degrees out of phase. All of this is now teachable, flameinmind.com, with brainwave biofeedback. And so you implode, and the low frequency phase coherence of the brain waves are exactly the same phase conjugate pump wave, which is the Schumann harmonic series. The same frequencies are there. And that measurably causes your DNA to braid recursively, thread, string, rope, fat rope, perfected embedding, until the DNA actually turns inside of embedded, becomes toroidal DNA, and implode. It lines up the spark gaps of the hydrogen at the center of the DNA helix, and that's called getting a soul. It makes you into a squirt gun. And it only works if you have bliss, because it's the only thing that implodes the DNA. It's what Luke Skywalker was doing with Yoda when he was learning how to have the Force be with you. You know that Yoda is now the lead electrical engineer for bioactivefield.com. Did you know that? I'm joking. So the physics is that this business about getting DNA accelerated up to speed is the opposite of the Borg Empire. This is when the Empire Strikes Back. You see, but there evolved in the Draco culture a hive mind central computer whose acronym was Ashtar. Actually, we believe, and this central computer became the centerpiece of the hive mind of the Draco, and it was behind the expressions, "It is a privilege to be assimilated," and "I am 7 of 9, I shall never feel alone." It was because in a hive mind, the elimination of the agony of feeling separate also eliminates the possibility of empathy and the possibility, therefore, of compassion. So in a Borg culture, you don't find empathy or compassion because empathy or compassion is born out of the pain of feeling separate, because it's literally the moment when you decide to experiment with feeling something outside as if it were inside, which is to say the EKG's trigger charge donut. And we now know literally the physics of the electric field that causes the heart to fire. The famous book, When Time Breaks Down, by Arthur T. Winfrey. That the electric field, which is a nest of a donut inside a donut, which converges implosively and causes your heart to fire. And what literally allows the heart to fire to grow a bigger electrical field is when a bigger donut nests inside the little donut, and then a bigger one yet, and then a big one yet. This is a recursive sequence of turning inside out, which actually creates a potentially infinite, or phase conjugate field around the heart, sometimes known as the planes of Sharon, which is the physics of the phase conjugate dielectric infinite field around monatomic gold, and the Hebrew name for heaven, as Lawrence Gardner correctly deduced. So the increasing field effect around the heart is achieved by recursive turning inside out, which is perfected embedding, and that allows you to suck the outside in and feel what's outside as if it were inside. And that's the physics of perfected empathy or compassion, perfected embedding. And that does not happen in a Borg culture. It does not happen without the experience of the agony of separateness, which triggers this urge to turn inside out and feel something outside as if it were inside. So there's a deep mystery here about the way in which total telepathy in a Borg culture actually prevents the possibility of empathy. And this is part of the lesson of Inanna Returns and Deep Space Nine, and that's sort of another lesson. But we see that the themes we started with here now give us a pretty good handle on what happened on Earth, that we inherited the political conflict of the Draco-Orion Wars in the origins of religion on Earth. And by not understanding the roots of that conflict, the wars over where is the Stargate, Durrana, otherwise known as the War over Jerusalem, the war between the sexes, all of these conflicts, the war over cloning versus bliss, you see, all of these conflicts on Earth, we're condemned to repeat the Orion Wars and do Groundhog Day with that story until we get the history correct. And the history, it's not about, learning every event in history so much as learning the pure principle of the science lesson. Once you learn the science lesson of history, then history is a nightmare that you can wake up from and forget. But the physics lesson is important. The ancestors chose sexual reproduction, started the war of the sexes to accelerate evolution. And then where did they get the fear of sex and fear of women from? Where did they get the different languages from? Where did the Tower of Babel come from? Babel, Ba'abel, Ba, as in Beelzebub, was the name Enlil gave to Enki, which later became Bo, as in Bohemian and Bogamite, as in Beelzebub's tales to his grandson. So, for example, Enlil's assignment here was territorial administrator because he won a few battles for his father. And the term for that was the great Satam, S-A-T-A-M, from which we get our word Satan. Whereas Enki's job here was related to the Beelzebub, or Beelzebub's tales to his grandchildren, if you believe the Gurdjieff book we read in its entirety out loud. And that became the word Lucifer. And Lucifer's stone, which is his eye, which later became the Kaaba of the Muslim, which in the Kaaba, that glass meteorite had vaporized gold propagating and became a powerful phase conjugate dielectric, which you rotate around in the ritual of the Kaaba, and you create implosive capacitance, otherwise known as human bliss. And later the Kaaba stone, which is based on golden ratio, which is a propagated platinum group metal, gold vapor propagates through the molten glass of that particular meteorite, the class of glass meteorites, which turns that glass meteorite into an implosive capacitor called a phase conjugate dielectric. And Dee and Kelly originally did their gold making alchemy with a bit of that ground up glass, perfect implosive phase conjugate capacitor, in a rice-sized grain wrapped with wax, which is a wetting agent, dripped alchemically into the red-hot mercury in the center of a magnetic pentagram, which was implosive, with the right alignments, and they made the purest gold documented in history ever measured by the British Royal Society, which is why Queen Elizabeth had to send her best spy, Shakespeare, under the name of Francis Garland, F.G., into John Dee's lab in Prague. Because if Rudolph got the alchemy. So you see, this story of Lucifer's eye is actually the story of Enki, who, Lucifer versus Satan, it was just a question of the guy who wins the war writes the history. And if you don't have the public relations budget, then you're the devil. And Lucifer didn't have the public relations budget, so he's the devil. But actually, his sin was saying that you too can be God. And you know what? He's right. If what you mean by God is the only possible real meaning of God, and that is the ability to become a plasma being that's sustainable or immortal. And the only way to do that is to squirt your plasma bubble out through the heart of the star and grow up and become a sun god, like our solar heart community, the solar shamans, solar heart community at yahoogroups.com. All of the shamans see the heart of the sun as an eyeball. So you see, the plasma science actually unifies the short history of God into a story about growing up and creating a coherent aura, centripetally enough, to become psychokinetic, plasma projective, empowered, etc., etc. Right, Hayem says we should generate education and communication. Yeah, that's what we need here. Oh, yes. Terry Burns is mentioning beautifully about Doris Lessing. Thank you, Terry. Yes, Doris Lessing was a Sufi, and she wrote the Syrian experiments and the Shikasta experiments about these giant fallen entities who were basically stuck here. They were like stuck, in a corner of their lucid dream and couldn't get back to the heart of their star. And one of the things that Doris Lessing talks about, thank you, Terry, that's very useful. She talks about what's called the substance of we feeling. You know how if you go into a home where there's a family, where there's lots of love, that the actual electric quality of the air in that house will begin to be syrupy. It's literally touch permissive electrically, which is to say there's a lot of plasma embedding going on. And this is what Doris Lessing called generating the substance of we feeling, which you could roughly translate is to generating the critical mass in a bliss cocoon for a group of people to fuse in their plasma as one and begin to travel as one in a plasma ball, like the 9. Okay, so the substance of we feeling is actually plasma embeddability physics. That's what it is, which is to say, if the practice of compassion is practiced widely enough in a core group, eventually they find themselves able to lucid dream together as one, to steer their plasma body as one. And that creates critical inertial escape velocity. And that's what the lucid dreaming core group needs to do when they arrive at the bliss temple or plasma cocooning, which is what the Therify.net does, which is what in ancient times was called Dharana or Stargate. Now, if you align those plasma tubes, that implosive environment, and the core group comes together and fuses as one to become collectively plasma projectable, taking their to a new home, children to a new home in the sun, as it was said in the song, taking their plasma bubble to a new home in the sun. What that is that's the possibility of growing up. That's what soul groups are designed to do. So it is not enough to go to the Stargate. Unless your aura is ready, you cannot be plasma imploded. There's a little funny story about that when I think it was Billy Myers, he was on the north shore of Lake Maggiore, and I think it was Alex Collier was on the other shore of that lake talking to these Pleiadian ships. And one day, Billy Myers was having an emotional bad hair day. He was upset. And they could not beam him up into the ship with the normal mechanism, and they had to use something much more painful. Beam me up, Scotty, there's no intelligent life down here. Well, the process of beaming up is actually phase translation into longitudinal component, requiring massive phase coherence in the aura. And that's the science, and Billy Myers actually tells the story. So the mechanism of beam me up, Scotty, requires a very specific physics that your aura has to be ready for phase conjugation. So Hayam here is talking about artificial light is accelerating human mind nowadays. Well, we should talk about artificial light a little bit here. What we're recognizing is now we know the frequency signature required for implosive phase transition, otherwise known as bliss or peak perception. So if you take, we know, for example, that if you remove the poisonous fluorescent light from your child's classroom and you install sunlight, you can measure a dramatic increase in attention span. This is old news. This is John Ott's book, Health and Light. But now the physics behind that is so instructive that the reason the frequency harmonics of the sunlight measurably create attention span, which fluorescent light measurably destroys, it's very important for schools to know this, is because the frequency signature of the possibility of attention is actually phase conjugate optics. And basically, if you start with the physics of photosynthesis, you understand the frequencies required to create attention in light. Fractalfield.com/fractal photosynthesis. We document that whole story there. So we know exactly the optical frequencies necessary to generate attention and bliss, and they're pure phase conjugate to Planck, the same way the exact only two frequencies that make photosynthesis possible are generated because they fit my equation perfectly on the cover of my book. So the reason artificial light in general destroys attention is because we don't know what attention is. Once you know what attention is, fractalfield.com/conjugate perception is the frequency recipe for making attention possible. It's well documented, well known, and teachable if you use the equation on the cover of my book. in the Schumann harmonics, the brainwave harmonics, and the optical harmonics, and the Therify harmonics are all the same frequency signature, and they create the possibility of plasma projection, plasma implosion, and therefore they create the possibility of attention. So it's the beginning of designing an environment optically which makes attention and bliss possible, and plasma projection, and becoming a sun god, ultimately. And this is an introduction to what at bioactivefield.com, bioactivefield.com, we describe as the Bioactive Glass Project. We have here some samples of the, what's it called, the glass? Mayron, the Mayron glass, which is a deep blue glass. I'm going to get it here. One second. They were kind enough to send us some samples. In this particular glass, it's well documented that seed germination and food preservation is dramatically improved. Now, if you look closely, you can see it's not actually black. It's actually just a deep blue. Well, the optical transmission frequencies here are a rough approximation of my equation, but now we know how to perfect this so we can make bioactive glass actually create life, germination, and food preservation, because we make an optical phase conjugators on the precisely correct colors. And that's the Bioactive Glass Project described at bioactivefield.com. And parallel to that, we have a major business partner, William, there in California, designing bioactive LEDs for bioactive lighting, which will then beautifully replace the lighting. And we're starting with incubators in hospitals for babies and greenhouse environments for perfected bioactive lighting. And bioactive LEDs are another example of creating literally an immortality creating, or at least a life generating optical color field. John Wong says, what type of indoor lighting do you recommend? Compact fluorescent lights are not good for health and attention, right? Well, actually, what's called full spectrum lighting is now becoming very well known, and many lighting salespersons know what that is. And full spectrum lighting moves in the useful direction we're talking about here. One example, for example, is the optical fluorescent tubes made by GE called GE Chroma 50, otherwise known as Artis lighting. And they build a light that more closely emulates the frequency spectrum of sunlight, which more closely emulates my equation if it's done right, based on hydrogen fusion. And they call it Artis lighting. Well, in fact, I had my father install the GE Chroma 50 lighting in our family business, electric motor, in Buffalo, New York. And sure enough, it was a dramatic success. Improved business, improved health, improved morale. Everybody's happier. It works. It's real. It's powerful. It's commercially worth the investment to install full spectrum lighting, which emulates sunlight and grow lights. So sunlight lighting, full spectrum lighting, grow lighting, these are approximations of implosive conjugate lighting, which we now could perfect far more accurately if people would just use the equation on the cover of my book. An example of a sad example in this situation is we had the natural health food stores in, I think it was Santa Fe and in Denver. And I think it was Wild Oats and what was the other one? But always they would install these horrible, absolutely poisonous mercury vapor lighting and the sodium lightings in these stores. And you'd walk in and you could feel the aura on the top of your head just burning out like it was hell. And obviously it was going to half kill everybody that walked in. And they called this a health food store when in fact they were using poisonous lighting. It's insane, but it's simply because science doesn't even know what life force in lighting is that anybody used such a poisonous emission spectrum as mercury vapor or even sodium. The frequencies spectrum of those things are poisonous. And when you walk in, you can feel the top of your head burning off. It's literally putting a hole in your aura. It's terrible. It's hell. So they call it a health food store and you're walking into hell just because they don't know what healthy lighting is. This is an example where my father, when he installed the full spectrum lighting, absenteeism went down, health went up. It's like that famous bank in Amsterdam, where after they installed the sevenfold flow forms, absenteeism went to zero. When you're in an implosive environment, you don't want to leave. So there's a very important commercial aspect to the science of life force. Yeah, the mercury vapor and the sodium vapor arc lighting it has a frequency signature. Yeah, that kind of light gives me headaches. Exactly. But now we know why, Terry, that kind of lighting gives you a headache. Because a headache is basically the opposite of implosion, whereas pure conjugate implosion is actually bliss in your head. John Wong says, how about the old-fashioned incandescent lights? Are they any good? Well, actually, all I can think about is Nikola Tesla discovering how to make reversible cold fusion in his famous car after he learned what was happening in the chemistry of the perfect carbon arc lamp. A perfect carbon arc has a frequency signature which has cold fusion written right inside it. So cute, so cool. And that is a quality of light which is very approximating conjugation. It's a fabulous thing. Whereas conventional incandescent lighting is using a filament and 60 or 50 cycle. And the primary dominant frequency there is obviously 50 or 60 cycle. Now we're studying that now, and we're actually studying this as it relates to the Therify. But the preliminary suggestion would be that 60 hertz is the frequency at which the voltage required to stop the heart is lowest, meaning it's probably almost poisonous. So although Tesla chose 60 hertz for convenience in designing 1725 RPM three-phase motors, the fact was Tesla didn't understand life force, or he would have picked something else. As opposed to 50 cycle here in Europe, if you do my equation, guess what? Planck time times integer exponent golden ratio, one of the numbers that pops out of the equation is 49.998 or something like that hertz. It's almost gorgeously 50 cycle. So it turns out that 50 hertz is actually a frequency which enables the possibility of phase conjugation and bliss. For example, if you were tracking a Tibetan Lama who's making what's called famously the Tibetan gamma in his brainwaves and projecting the rainbows they do at the time of death, Tibetan gamma goes from 44 to 50 hertz. You know what the perfect frequency from the Schumann harmonic cascade, which is the origin of alpha, beta, and brainwaves, lands on 50 cycle, Tibetan gamma. So the point being that there is such a thing as sacred frequencies. And that's that article, fractalfield.com/implosion sound, and many of you have downloaded, and you can actually play with the perfecting the perfect binaural beat there, and that's an introduction to a part of the low frequencies we use for the Therify. But without the high frequency megahertz component, of course, you can't ignite the plasma. So let's think about if we have told the story we came here to tell, which was the short history of God. We got to the Satan versus Lucifer, the meaning of Shem, Amana. One of the things we were supposed to talk about in tonight's outline was the origin of Holy Communion. If you want to do a short history of God, you probably need to tell a story of the origin of Holy Communion. Holy Communion was served in a round white wafer originally, which was the way in which gold powder, manna, ormus, the spice, was served. Now, it's true, under certain atmospheric conditions, a trace mineral charge-dense substrate could precipitate right out of the atmosphere with moisture, temperature, and charge, and trace mineral conditions ideal. And this could be manna from heaven. And we have pictures on our website of what's called the manna machine, which is one of the names for the Ark of the Covenant. So the use of gold powder in ancient times is related to our short history of God. And Thomas has documented that plasma implosion can dramatically charge the ormus material but it has to be done very carefully because you don't want to have it transmute inside the plasma cylinder. So it's a very tricky operation. And alchemists know more about this, like Paul, who is our plasma expert. So the point being that while Sitchin says they came here to mine the gold to repair their home atmosphere, which is, I believe, true, and trace gold material, gold vapor in glass, making the red glass of the Gothic cathedrals, and making the Kaaba stone of the Muslims, the vaporized gold through the alchemic glass turns the glass into a sponge geometry that's a conjugating dielectric, and therefore the philosopher's stone, the alchemist's seed, Nicholas Flamel, and the philosopher's stone, attention Emma Watson. But also that gold in the air, a percentage of gold vapor in the air, will trigger a conjugate relationship in the air, which will help create centripetal conjugate dielectric fields in the atmosphere, and that centripetal electric field is key to atmosphere maintenance. And this is what Sitchin was referring to when he said they were using the gold to repair atmosphere on the home star. There is some truth to that. The fabrication of a conjugate grid in the atmosphere is essential to atmosphere maintenance. This is discussed in great detail under the concept of planet taming in the book 2/3 by David Myers and David Percy, which we discuss at great length with pictorial in the web article goldenmean.info/Babylon. And there's the link right there, Babylon. And basically what they meant by planet taming, for example, the reason the Cydonia and Giza pyramid complex were at tetrahedral latitude was it could modulate the planet grid alignment to perfect embeddability, which is to say phase angle, to zodiacal spin. And if zodiacal spin was more accurately phase embedded in planetary spin, and you tune the spin rates of planets by dolmen at tetrahedral latitudes, something I suspect Hoagland is actually clueless about, and that would create the embeddability centripetal rotational mechanics to embed the little spin inside the big spin. I actually have a gyroscope. We used to teach this, how you get a little spin. It's in the bag over there. If the little spin nutates and precesses in phase to the big spin translates its vorticity non-destructively into the little spin, which means zodiacal spin feeds planetary spin. And that cascade of harmonics called phase conjugation is the definition of the centripetal force named the gravity. In other words, in order to maintain atmosphere around planets, you need to modulate these spin dynamics to increase these centripetal forces. You do this dance for stabilizing atmosphere. And planets that don't learn the physics of how centripetal forces are created and how gravity stabilizes don't deserve to keep their atmosphere. So I say this planet deserves to lose its atmosphere until we learn to create centripetal forces. That's called biofeedback. This is a hermetic lesson. And we talked about this at goldenmean.info/Babylon. And this is one of the major themes in the book 2/3 by David Myers and David Percy, which portends to be related to the Arcturian and Andromedan story. Ah, yes, Susan Rose says the air is very high in gold here in Delunga. The first gold rush was here. It literally calls the actual Trail of Tears, which began right here in this town. Yes, the Trail of Tears is actually a trail of gold. And, you know, the community we started in North Carolina there at Asheville, Waynesville, was associated with the Trail of Tears as well. And it was on the Trail of Tears that I originally discovered my clairaudience that was part of the Kundalini experience, because I was hearing Cherokee ancestors, and I was hearing them weeping under this very particular sacred tree there, which was part of the Trail of Tears. So, and, you know, it's these kind of energy lines which are the waveguides for ancestral memory. So it's in these environments where they would have their burial grounds. And you see, what we later learned was that community Circle of Life in Waynesville, which is where the geodesic was designed by Bucky Fuller, installed by John Denver there that we had our community. And that tree was part of this Cherokee burial ground. And the women were always, the young women in our community would wake up crying for no reason, and they would be hearing ancestral Cherokee ancestors weeping. And so the physics of what is a burial ground is actually a doorway, a portal to this phase conjugate dielectric fractal field, a place where embeddability in the collective unconscious ancestral memory is possible. And this science was native to Dragon Blood and Dracos. They knew where to keep their auras alive. And so the Cherokee ancestors understood this very well. And this, among the Cherokee, was called the Adawi. And the Adawi, we later learned, was the Cherokee name for Ophanim, which is the bird tribe, the winged ones, the burly ones. In fact, we have an article about that, goldenmean.info/Adawi. And how we learned that originally was I was showing this Ophanim Enochian alphabet you have right here as I taught at in Sunray Meditation Community there for who's a Cherokee shaman lady that we taught? And in the Cherokee shaman school there, Dahani Wahoo. And she had invited me to teach there. And so I showed her these Ophanim Enochian letters. And she said, oh, no, this is the language of the Cherokee Star Elders, the Adawi, which is the winged ones. So that bird tribes of the Cherokee were the same as the Ophanim Enochian that John Dee was talking to. And these were the interstellar plasma being of Cherokee ancestors. And they were inhabiting these hills there in North Carolina, just north of where you are there, Susan, in Georgia. And we went back and forth, and that's a good memory. So wonderful. Yes, and Susan says, these patterns are what we have had the opportunity to work with to heal from here, it seems. Wayne is saying, I found that my plants with the fan, the gold leaves, cooking leaves on them. Yes. In fact, gold foil was edible in Chinese tradition. And we were finishing that story that when the gold atom is subjected to a conjugate dielectric field, the gold atom, like popcorn, turns inside out, and when it implodes through center, the gold atom electron shells suddenly become extremely charged radiant, the planes of Charon, heaven literally, the phase conjugate dielectric field, extremely charged radiant state of the imploded gold atom. And the arc capacitance to do that, related to the Ark of the Covenant originally, and related to the field created by the Therify plasma device, is actually what triggers the symmetry implosive operation of the monoatomic gold to become soluble in water and blood. In other words, that's what makes the gold really edible. So the thing that Sitchin probably didn't understand when he said they were mining the gold to repair the atmosphere was, oh, they were also mining the gold to eat it, which is much more well instructed in the Dune series, Frank Herbert, where he calls it the spice. And it does have a cinnamon smell. And, your eyes turn blue and you live forever, but there's a little piece in the fine print saying it may cost you your soul. And this is a very introduction to a very sophisticated understanding of the psychodynamics of gold powder consumption, which we discuss at goldenmean.info/gold powder. And to try to summarize there, that Thoth had a narrated series of instructions to avoid fractionation of the personality when eating gold powder. And we know that the gold powder made by David Hudson, which was made purely chemically, was in many cases quite dangerous. It could burn the aura, and it was actually fairly dangerous. And I have some, and I can tell you for sure that it's a dangerous material. Whereas more organically created gold powder materials that come from natural rhodium, iridium emulates like the aloe in the Manalo Manatech, and the organically derived, natural seawater derived agricultural ormes like Thomas Geckler and others have used. That natural sources of this material create an information communion with a natural stream of nature. Whereas if you close your eyes and have a series of visions after you eat some of the David Hudson gold powder, what you have a flash series of is the chemistry lab cooking pots in which he made the stuff. It's like a kind of a little Borg ancestry kind of thing. So it is a memory communion that gold powder triggers, and it should be done with attention to the hygiene. So it is true that the wrong kind of gold powder can actually burn a hole in your aura and make you dizzy. But the skill and the ritual to properly derive and use the gold powder materials was very much associated with what Lawrence Gardner calls the star fire. And we've told the story before, but just to review, that even the origins of mummification, remember we were joking about the fact that mummy powder was served in every pharmacy in Europe for 300 years. And I thought, oh, well, these ancient Egyptians, they were addicted to gold powder eating. But no, the natron in the salt in the bandage, in addition to a drying capacity of the mummy, had a capacitance which would organically convert, if the flesh were healthy, the flesh actually into a rhodium iridium emulet. So in fact, that flesh in the mummy's body was transmuted into a form of gold powder, which was akin to a kind of immortalization of the aura, because it made the temple plasma, the body's aura charge cocoon, or ka, into plasma projective. Not unlike the Tibetan practice of always encasing their really advanced dead saints into gold foil, as described in one of Anne Rice's books about the gold, the man who was dipped in gold and became gold embedded. It was, all these were perversions in the attempt to create an immortal aura, which is actually the physics of creating a charge embeddable, perfectly distributable charge cocoon, which is, say, a phase conjugate or fractal field, where then the wave geometry of your aura and its memory could become embedded in a perfectly distributed field effect, which is only maintainable in a fractal field, which is why the Hopis were so specific about their burial ground. You're not going to put metal pipes in here on older ivy, because this will destroy the memories of their ancestors, and they're right. Let's see, Joyce says, possible to eat the gold plate painters use. You know, the Chinese have very detailed instructions on how you prepare the gold foil on the surface of the cake before you eat it. Very pure, very thin, very fine. But actually, if the gold is properly prepared, it's akin to preparing gold powder. And again, the very organic sources of these in very small quantities can be very enervating to the aura, and your eyes will turn blue and you will live forever. But the reason the gold powder addiction causes fractionation of the personality is because if you eat some gold powder and your ears begin to ring as they do, we even know the frequencies at which the ears begin to ring, the sangreal, the sound current, the song in the blood. In my book, we have the chart of the harmonics of the ringing in the ears heard by meditators, and I've done the calculations to show the frequency signature fit the phase conjugate array, etc., etc. So you eat the gold powder and your ears begin to ring more and more. Now, for some people, when your ear rings, you know which ear is ringing and which ancestor's calling. This is my mother. We're smiling here. But the ears ringing has actually been studied. And with Kundalini, your ears can begin to ring very loudly. And Bentov tracked what this was. He showed by measurement that the natural liquid resonances of the ventricle liquid cavities of the brain were fired up to a phonon wave. Remember, phonon's longitudinal. And that phonon wave rotates in a toroidal shape around the brain surface, and he actually tracked the sequence of what part of your brain was triggered in what order and proved that this was a homunculus little man sequence in what part of the body you felt a bolt of lightning going from your tailbone up to the crown of your head. It was actually a magnetic donut happening inside your head on the homunculus. It's all in your head. And we documented that homunculus story, and we talked about in the physics of Kundalini. It's goldenmean.info/Kundalini. So, if you ate too much gold powder and you weren't prepared, you saw soluble gold in the blood, DNA implodes more and more, and you hear this phonon triggering ringing in your head. And now you got more ancestors making phone calls. The problem is that if you get too many ancestors making phone calls at once, that's the definition of schizophrenia, which is the way in which Kundalini is most often diagnosed in a sadly misinformed medical community. Kundalini Psychosis or Transcendence was the title of Lisa Nella and Bentoff's first book on Kundalini. So voices in your head is the definition of Kundalini, and it's the definition of bliss. How are we going to know the difference? Voices in your head is the definition of schizophrenia, and it's a definition of Kundalini. So how are we going to know the difference? How do we know the difference between schizophrenia and human bliss? I mean, it's way too easy to romanticize schizophrenia. It's a sad and frightening thing. In fact, my graduate professor, Albert Axe, pioneered brain chemistry of schizophrenia in the psychophysiology lab, where we pioneered the first polygraph to electrically discriminate fear and anger in pure electrical terms. So I have a lot of background there. And I can remember reading that book, The Three Christs of Ypsilanti, about, schizophrenic, three people who were medically hospitalized for believing they were Jesus Christ. Collective mind, collective memory, this is, there's a certain appropriateness there, but there's also a very destabilizing element. And so they put the three people who were hospitalized for believing they were Jesus, they put the three of them in one room, closed the door, and turned on a microphone, and that's the book, Three Christs of Ypsilanti. Well, you think it sounds funny, but actually it's the fact that the collective mind is a unifying field. So do we now have a better clue to what is the difference between schizophrenia and human bliss when we now know that human bliss switches on DNA radio, voices in your head? So what's the difference between the disease and the bliss? The difference is having the willpower to sort more radio stations. That's what it is. It's just like if you get too many tornadoes going at once, you can't sort to embed yourself in the center point, create the low pressure, and steer. That's why there's a definite hygiene to limiting the ability to have bliss, the concept of bliss nini. In the same way, we say, spend a short time in the Therify field and then get grounded and do the hydration for the same reason. So we're beginning to get the idea that clairaudience can be a beautiful thing, to hear the ringing in your the ringing in your ears heard by meditators. Psychologists cannot prove that all these millions of meditators that hear their ears ring, they're not all sick. No. There's something useful about hearing a ringing in your ear. It can be a DNA radio to ancestral memory, and that's real, and that has tremendous survival value. But how do you avoid becoming ungrounded and mentally ill? And that is an inner strength to hold together more tornadoes. It's very much like the fact that human bliss is literally like inhabiting a lightning bolt. And you approach embedding in lightning bolts gently, a little bit at a time, Kundalini. Otherwise, if it's released all at once, it can be very debilitating. Like Daniel Brinkley found out in his book on near-death experience after his DNA became a superconductor after being hit by lightning. It's the movie Powder all over again. So the hygiene to these things is related to the science of bliss. And you see how this is all related to the history of religion on this planet, which is a history of the science of living plasma or charge, called Chi Orgone Baraka or Shaktipat. the quality of grace. Ray says, I've been listening to this ringing. Wish I knew someone was trying to tell me. Yes. The thing is, if you hear a ringing in your head and you go someplace extremely charged, a really sacred space, and get really still, that ringing in your head will go to a climax experience, like a bliss experience, extreme stillness, and it'll feel like lightning inside. And you ride that to an implosive point, which is to say, literally a peak experience. And the more that ringing and that lightning of charge becomes dense, and you feel the lightning get tighter and tighter and stronger, it increases the negentropy and the sorting. So effectively, the ringing is saying memories needed to be sorted now. And following that sorting possibility to the climax is literally following your bliss. So in the same way that sometimes romantically, I knew some women, a lady particularly in Santa Fe, who was having epileptic seizures. And I'm not saying all epilepsy is like this, but there's some of it that is. She was starting to have the beginnings of epileptic seizure, and I could see that what it was that she was resisting the stillness of bliss. And in the same way, when you have this ringing, if you don't resist and go with it and ride the sound current to a climax experience, you know how people who live in cities cannot stand quiet? Whereas people who've learned to seek bliss seek only quiet? That is a difference between those who can sort their memories. Yeah, Wayne says, I noticed this when driving back to town for about 12 hours and having a dab of warmness. Cool, Wayne. Exactly. So let's see. We carried on here. I'm not sure we finished our story. Where are our pictures here? Oh, yes. So we were supposed to tell the story here just briefly in the last pictures. This is from the Emerald Tablets of Thoth Hermes, showing that the roots of the Emerald Tablets of Thoth also relate to the Bon Po language. And this is the Bon Po Tibetan alphabet here from their creation myth. And notice the swastika, which later became our Grail animation, that actually the ancestral memories of the Emerald Tablets are the same as the Bon Po. And whether it's Bon Po or Cherokee, you do not pass as a shaman until you can make a flame with your mind. And that is a hermetic tradition of making the plasma implode. And so guiding the plasma toward the swastika, the Grail science, the phase conjugate geometry of implosion, steering the plasma to an implosive still point, that is the climax point of the initiation of both Bon Po's bonfire and the Cherokee. And we did that ritual of flame in the mind with the Cherokee, with the Haniwahu, lighting a fire with their mind in the Arboretum there, in the Sunray Meditation Society there, with the Cherokee in New England. So I think maybe that's our happily ever after for this evening. What other pictures have we missed here? Oh yeah, this is the alphabet of Thoth, the Atlantean from the Emerald Tablets. And this is about the charge envelope, which now is a Therify. At that time it was Purify.com. And here we're charging rock powders and documenting the effect on seed germination. And we will be doing that now with the plasma of the Therify, charging rock powders to heal water and for flocculent precipitate pollutants with charged rock powder like Plocker.de does, except now we know the physics of the ideal charge for rock powder and charging seeds to accelerate growth. From the Seeds of Knowledge book, we now know that plasma implosion is the appropriate way to ignite seeds just before planting them, which was the original purpose of the Shem stones, major purpose, and the standing stones like Stonehenge was to save agriculture by charging seeds and water and rock powder, in addition to plasma protection for the shaman, in addition for enabling successful birth and death. The ring of stones is now the ring of plasma and the ring of the Therify. Eden Grace says, any comments about the new class listed? Any other classes coming up? The next week's class is with our wonderful guest speaker, Dr. El Sheikh from Sudan, life principle fractalU.com. And he has done the mathematics to show the nature of self-organizing field from an entirely new mathematic perspective, which totally complements and confirms our work on bioactive fields and Therify and self-organization in life. And yet he says it has a completely independent mathematics to show the nature of self-organization in the life principle, perfectly complementary to what we're doing. We're very excited to work with Dr. El-Sheikh from Sudan, and we have, for that reason, also helped him with his website, lifeprinciple.com, and his book and his papers, and many of his PDF papers are all there at lifeprinciple.com. So we invite you to join us 1 week from today when Dr. El-Sheikh presents here at fractalu.com. Now, regarding your other question, Eden, about other classes, we have decided that at fractalu.com, we're very glad that we've created this material and these videos and that thousands of people are seeing these films. That's wonderful. And we're happy to share them after the class for free with the world. And this has become shareable information. And we're probably not going to repeat these classes per se. We're going to be bringing new material and radically new breakthroughs. So we add to this with unique new perspective and not repeat the existing classes. So probably there will be upcoming classes now on the wonderful heart rate variability biofeedback app, hrv-app.com, and there will be class on Flame in Mind, flameinmind.com, coming up in the brainwave biofeedback, and then there will be classes on the Zero Point Energy Technologies, the implosionamp.com, with the Brazilian and the Canadian groups. So there will be new topics coming to fractalu.com, so stay tuned. Thanks for your loyalty. Thanks for your dedication. Thanks, guys, for coming back every time. It's all cool. Any final questions before we leave tonight? Was that a happily ever after? We didn't really tell the whole story, but we introduced the story with enough enthusiasm to make it probable that hopefully you will be interested enough to go read the material for yourselves on the short history of God at fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood, and then the Anton Parks books, Eden and Mystery of the Dark Stars. Thank you, Eden. Thanks, everybody. Blessings, sweet dreams. Take care. Goodbye. It's been wonderful. Let's share the vision with the world. We become a shareable wave in the real science of spirit. Blessings. Good night, everybody. Bye, Terry. Bye, everybody.